Born in Inverness, Scotland, William Trent immigrated to Philadelphia and established himself as a very successful, though slave-owning, shipping merchant. In 1714, he acquired much of the land on the banks of the Delaware River that is now the city of Trenton, and in 1719 built his early Georgian-style, George I period mansion on his plantation there. Entertainments he hosted would likely to have included music by 18th century British composers, William Croft, John Blow, and Jeremiah Clarke, in particular, who composed Scots-inspired compositions, who were then in vogue in the years following the death of Henry Purcell in 1695. We will perform the music in an imagined, if not virtual, setting of the room interiors of William Trent. For the period, the Trent House is one of the finest examples of high-style architecture built in early 18th century America. Throughout the 18th century, music making was increasingly part of the accomplishments through which good manners and good taste could be displayed. For a gentleman, in addition to sportsmanship, hunting, playing a musical instrument such as the English flute, today the treble or alto recorder, violin or German flute or traverso, cello and harpsichord, as well as proficiency in dance, were among the fashionable skills to be cultivated under the tutelage of music and dancing masters. Music making, while certainly enjoyed in solitude, was also conducted in the company of family and friends as a felicitous collaborative endeavor, and as such was thought to contribute to and illustrate social harmony. Ladies, by the way, were well acquainted with playing either the harp, the English guitar, or the harpsichord. While William Trent is not known to have played a musical instrument, he would have heard music and certainly attended dance assemblies in Philadelphia. The practitioners of music will perform late 17th and 18th century Scottish-inspired music, including harpsichord works by Croft and Clarke, composers both active during William Trent's lifetime, as well as later Scots composers such as James Oswald of Edinburgh, who, whilst living in London, was a friend of none other than Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Coincidentally, Robert Bremner, as we will learn, composer and publisher, supplied music to Francis Hopkinson of Bordentown and Philadelphia. Hopkinson was also one of New Jersey's 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence. William Croft was in his day a renowned organist and composer whose earliest training as a chorister in the Chapel Royal seems to have been under the guidance of John Blow. He succeeded his mentor Blow as organist of Westminster Abbey, master of the children of the Chapel Royal, and composer to Queen Anne. Best known for his sacred compositions, he also wrote for the theater. Other secular works include songs, music for harpsichord and organ, and solo sonatas for the violin, as well as for the English flute, an instrument today we call the recorder. He is buried in the abbey near Henry Purcell's tomb. Listen now to the Scots tune for harpsichord from the Harpsichord Master, London, 1697. From the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, we have the extraordinary Glen collection of Scottish songs and music of the 18th and early 19th centuries, including music for Highland bagpipe and scores of other musical instruments, as well as for the voice. A collection assembled by John Glen, 1833 to 1904. The setting that you will hear comes from one of the treasures in the Glen collection, Generous Love, or Love's a Generous Passion. The melody by the London theatre composer Henry Carey is actually taken from a publication entitled The British Musical Miscellany, or The Delightful Grove, Volume 1. A copy of the same publication is in the private collection of the Practitioners of Music. The distinguished Edinburgh music publisher Robert Bremner, as well as supplier of music to the Edinburgh Music Society, issued over the course of a long career sacred and secular music, including his own skillfully arranged Scots reels or country dances, which included the first tunes identified as strathspeys. There actually is a fine Bremner family association with 18th century Philadelphia. Robert's brother James in 1763 moved to Philadelphia, where he taught harpsichord, German flute, initiated a series of subscription concerts modeled on the Edinburgh Music Society, and became a friend of Francis Hopkinson. When Hopkinson first visited London, he called on Robert Bremner, who thereafter sent packets of printed music to America's first native composer. The group of Robert Bremner tunes we will play for this program include Will You Go to Flanders, which we'll hear shortly, and later The Scots Ground and Cybele. Details of musician and publisher James Oswald's early life are shrouded in mystery. The first concrete reference occurs in 1734, announcing a collection of his own minuets in the broadsheet paper, the Caledonian Mercury. Subsequently, on a regular basis, he issued primarily collections of Scots tunes of all sorts, settling in London in the early 1740s. By all accounts an accomplished cellist, he came in the orbit of Frederick, Prince of Wales, himself a proficient cellist, and this set the stage for early patronage by royalty, which continued later with Oswald's appointment as chamber composer to George III in 1761. You will hear a setting of Lovely Nancy from Oswald's Curious Collection of Scots Tunes, Edinburgh, 1739. Francis Peacock, dancing master and musician, whose place of birth is unknown, appears in the Aberdeen Council Register 1747 as a capable master of a discreet and moral character. This same year he founded the Aberdeen Music Society, which gave private concerts with profits going to charity. His best-known publication is his 1762 arrangement of 50 favorite Scotch airs, from which the beautiful setting of Pinkie House is drawn. Pinkie House is essentially a towered castle, primarily associated with the Stuart court and cause. Charles I stayed at Pinkie House in 1637 when he came north for his coronation, and Prince Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, stayed at the house in 1745 in his ill-fated attempt to seize the throne from the Hanoverian George II. Scots ground that you're about to hear is drawn from the harpsichord or spinet miscellany published by Robert Bremner circa 1765, which was in effect a commercial item or a keyboard collection sold at a profit to a mass audience. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy, and so did Martha Parke Custis, inscribed January the 19th, 1769. This volume, with its special association, is one of the treasures of the collection of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. While Martha and George's union never produced offspring, but together they raised Martha's children from her previous marriage. The children were never legally adopted by Washington, so they retained the Custis surname of their natural father. By the way, this same variation set was copied into a music manuscript book in Philadelphia by Francis Hopkinson in the mid-1760s. Born in the West Country of England, conductor, composer, and publisher James Hewitt arrived in New York City via London in 1792. In New York, he soon became conductor of the orchestra at the famed Park Street Theater, where his duties included arranging and composing music for many ballad operas and other music productions. He also operated his own musical repository, where he gave lessons and sold musical instruments and music composed by himself and others. Later, in Boston, he served as organist of Trinity Church and conducted the orchestra at the Federal Street Theater. One of his well-known works is a keyboard piece entitled The Battle of Trenton, in fact, a keyboard sonata suitable both for harpsichord or forte piano, written in 1797 and dedicated to George Washington. The sonata includes numerous short sections such as Flight of the Hessians, Trumpets of Victory, Yankee Doodle, and Roslyn Castle, a particularly elegiac melody derived from Scottish sources. Roslyn Castle, built on a rocky promontory, is now a partially ruined castle located approximately 9 miles south of Edinburgh. With a hallowed historical record stretching back to the early 14th century as the near site of the Battle of Roslyn, where the Scots defeated the English in 1303. The earliest extant work in Scots prose, now in the National Library of Scotland, was written in the 15th century scriptorium at Roslyn Castle. Born in Aberdeen circa 1712, Charles MacLean taught in that city before moving to Edinburgh to play in the Edinburgh Music Society Orchestra. He was in London from the early 1740s and died there in 1772. MacLean composed repertory for the violin, some of which could be adapted for either German or English flute. We will perform now the sonata, "'Twas Within a Furlong of Edinburgh Town," essentially cast as a variation set andante, minuet, and giga, after a famed air that is in fact a mock Scottish theatre song by Henry Purcell, composed in London, 1694. The MacLean setting seems to date from his period in Edinburgh about the year 1738. Jeremiah Clark, organist and composer, is best known for his theater piece, or so-called trumpet voluntary, published in an arrangement as The Prince of Denmark's March. You will hear this march, a melody that will be very familiar to most of you. The Scotch trumpet tune that you will hear is taken from a keyboard anthology, The Harpsichord Master of 1697, but this music could also be easily adapted for chamber organ. Though no record of official appointment survives, he is thought to have been music master, the harpsichord teacher, to Queen Anne. Anne's consort was the Prince of Denmark. Among Clark's sacred and secular works, a pastoral elegy, Come, Come Along for a Dance and a Song, in memory of Henry Purcell. Born in Perthshire about the year 1721-22 into a land-owning Highland family, John Reid was educated at the University of Edinburgh, where he studied law, and while there presumably developed his musical talents, taking flute lessons. He successfully sought a commission in the army, serving in Scotland during the Jacobite period, and later bought a commission in the regiment dubbed the Black Watch. Reid soldiered thereafter in the West Indies and North America during the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. He continued his distinguished military career, albeit in Europe during the period of the Revolutionary War in America. He rose to the rank of general and retired rich. Mindful of the joy music brought him, he left the bulk of his fortune upon his death in 1807 to the University of Edinburgh, with the primary aim of establishing and endowing Scotland's first chair of music. Eventually, the university built the Reid School of Music as a result of his bequest. General Reid wrote 2 sets of solo sonatas for violin or flute, published in 1756 and 1762. You will hear a solo taken from a sonata in the set of 1762. Alexander Munro is one of the mystery figures of Scottish musical history, and nothing is known about his life and nothing about his compositions, apart from his collection of Scots tunes published in Paris in 1732, under the title that includes the words Air Écossois, or a collection of Scots airs, essentially variation sonatas or sets, in which traditional Scots melodies are transformed into, surprisingly, a succession of not French dances, but Italian dances in the sonata da camera or fashion of chamber sonatas. that is, Preludio, Correnti, Minuet, Sarabanda, and Giga. Or one could think of the Highlands meets the Italian Baroque, inspired by the model of Arcangelo Corelli. You will hear the first variation on the famed air Bonnie Jean of Aberdeen. The late scholar of Scottish music, David Johnson, believed by conjecture that our composer is one and the same with the Alexander Munro, who studied music in his youth and was later first professor of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Munro had many Parisian links, as Paris was a world-famous center for surgery, and this might explain why the collection was printed in France. We've already identified Robert Bremner as a prolific publisher of Scots melodies. Here is another melody called Cybele, which is taken from the harpsichord or spinet miscellany. Composer William Shield, born in northern England, received his earliest musical education from his father and continued his education with the celebrated Charles Avison in Newcastle, eventually finding his way to London, where he was associated with the King's Theatre Haymarket. His first London ballad opera success was The Flitch of Bacon of 1778, coincidentally produced in Philadelphia in 1792 through 1797 seasons during Washington's terms as President of the United States. In 1782, Shield produced Rosina, and through its success, Shield was appointed house composer at Covent Garden, one of the two London patent theatres. Rosina is set in the north of England, inspiring Shield to end its overture with a tune reminiscent of bagpipes. The tune became much better known as the music to Auld Lang Syne by Robert Burns, whose Comin' Through the Rye was also set by Shield. The two never met. When Shield's comic opera Rosina was first performed at Covent Garden in 1782, Scottish song enthusiasts may have recognized a snippet of melody played by oboe and bassoon in imitation of bagpipes toward the end of the overture. It was reminiscent of the Miller's Wedding, a popular Scottish country dance tune published by Robert Bremner about the year 1760 in a collection of Scots reels that foreshadowed the melody we now call Auld Lang Syne. Shield included several such folk references in the opera, and this led to repeated claims that he has composed the now famous air. So we've just played The Miller's Wedding and the final air in Rosina. The now famous words of Auld Lang Syne were first published in the 5th volume of James Johnson's Scots Musical Museum, Edinburgh, printed and sold by Johnson and Company 1796, an invaluable compilation to which Robert Burns was the principal contributor. Although he may not have been musically inclined himself, George Washington was the head of a household where his wife, her 2 children, and her 4 grandchildren, 2 of whom were raised by the Washingtons, all studied music. Granddaughter Nellie Parke Custis, renowned for her sweetness equal to her beauty, possessed, as one visitor to Mount Vernon wrote, all the talents. She plays the harpsichord and sings, draws better than any woman in America. Among surviving musical scores owned by Nellie Custis include airs from William Shield's Rosina and a songbook entitled Original Scottish Airs. Rosina was regularly performed in Philadelphia during both terms of Washington's presidency of the United States, at the time when Philadelphia, 1790 to 1800, was the capital of the nation. In retirement at Mount Vernon, in his own home, at Washington's request, music was part of his daily routine. After tea, if there were no ceremonious company which required his presence, he would listen to Nellie sing his favorite songs, including airs from Rosina.